Welcome everyone to Deep Drinks Podcast. Today, my guest is a 22-year-old YouTuber who dropped everything to go cover the Russian invasion and genocide in Ukraine. He's now become a respected journalist, in my eyes anyway, and getting incredibly important stories with boots on the ground journalism. I want to show everyone a quick clip from the kind of stuff that you can see if you go subscribe to his channel. So let's watch that now.
When the Russians invaded Ukraine again in 2022, many new regiments were formed to resist the invasion. One of these new regiments, that has exploded into the headlines through harsh combat, is the Main Directorate of Intelligence's Sabotage and Reconnaissance Unit, Kraken. Kraken formed as Russian troops in armor advanced on the eastern Ukrainian city of Kharkiv during the first few days of the war. It was made up of many local football ultras, veterans of the Azov Brigade, recon officers, and other veterans from the last 8 years of fighting in the Donbass. They not only succeeded in halting the Russian columns trying to capture the city, but also in pushing them out of it. They then would take part in an operation that would smash Russia's aura of invincibility for good, proving that the battle for Kiev was not a fluke and Ukraine could go on the offensive. The Ukrainians, including Kraken, launched a surprise counteroffensive in Kharkiv. The Russian line, stretched thin with many troops committed elsewhere in the country, broke. The Ukrainian army advanced rapidly, taking advantage of the break in the Russian line. They quickly liberated over 500 settlements in just over 3 weeks, pushing the Russian army almost entirely out of the Kharkiv region. While this Ukrainian victory fell somewhat out of the headlines rather quickly, as attention refocused south towards the Kherson counteroffensive, its impact cannot be understated. It was so startling to Moscow that it pushed Putin's regime to enact mobilization. I wanted to get a better understanding of both Kraken and this pivotal moment in the war that shook the Russians. So I went to the eastern Ukrainian city of Kharkiv to talk to a Kraken commander named Rostislav, who fought and commanded soldiers on the front line of the Kharkiv counteroffensive firsthand, helping to recapture many villages and even the city and the logistical center of Kupiansk.
Well, that is a just taste of some of the stuff you can see on Dylan Burns' channel. I'd highly recommend you go subscribe. Welcome, Dylan Burns.
Happy to be here. Thank you for having me.
I'm very excited to have you on because you chose whiskey at the last minute to drink. What are you drinking? You showed me behind the stream, but tell us again.
Sure. So I'll just grab whatever I can get. I'm not a really high shelf guy. I like Tennessee honey. I need that amber current. What was it? Who sang that? Amber Current soothe my mind. I forgot who sang that. Great country music star. But I picked up whatever said American on it because I miss home and I just wanted to get whatever thing they put stars and stripes on, had a bald eagle going caw caw. No, I don't care how cheap. And so I got this. It says authentic American, which indicates to me it isn't authentic, but anything that has to state it's authentic gives me that vibe. Owensboro, Kentucky bourbon whiskey. Extra smooth. And then it says bourbon is America's native spirit as declared by Act of Congress in 1964.
That's beautiful. That sounds like some premium whiskey. I've actually got a bottle of one of my favorite scotches, Lafroig 10-year. I'm a bit more of a snob. I guess that comes with age. Actually, I'll drink any whiskey, but I do prefer the finer things, the finer whiskeys. But I've got that today. It's 11 a.m. for me. I'm happy to drink with you at this time. It's acceptable to day drink in Australia. For your guests, for the people on your Twitch stream who don't know me, my name is Dave McDonald. I'm a former Christian youth pastor. I now run a YouTube channel where I talk to people about religion, philosophy, and human rights over a drink of their choice. But Dylan, I've got so much respect for you and what you've done moving over to Ukraine to cover the invasion. Anastasia put us in touch, which I'm really thankful for. And I believe, did you get Anna on Destiny's channel? Are you the one who set that up?
So I didn't specifically take her and put her on his channel, but I interviewed her a few times. In fact, I just interviewed her again with 3 other Ukrainians about a certain streamer. I'm very excited for that to get out, but that's all shh. can't talk too much about that. But when I interviewed her, during one of the interviews, she started talking about Hassan and how his commentary she was not very happy with. And I posted it on my channel because if there's anything I'd like to do is platform Ukrainians in online conversations where they're usually not represented, even though the future of their country is what's being discussed. And well, I didn't get a positive response from Hassan. I got banned from his Discord that I never posted in, and they didn't get a positive response from that direction. Destiny watched it, and then that put Anna in contact with Destiny, and then she did a ton of fundraising in Destiny's community when it comes to ear protection and like warm clothing for soldiers and different stuff they need to get the job done. So yeah, that's how they initially met, was through that interview.
Yeah, I like Anna was one of the best interviews we did on this channel. I think they had air raids happening, and she had to like run for cover in the interview. I don't know if you ever saw that clip, but it really brought home the gravity of the situation. My first question, I guess, is what do you think that? I mean, it's a broad question, but what do you think the media is getting wrong?
Oh God, the media is getting so many things wrong here. The first thing I think the media
gets difference between like boots on the ground versus what you think is being portrayed, I guess, is a better question.
Man, okay, I like the media. What does the media get wrong question better? Can I answer that one instead?
Yeah, go for it. Go for it.
One thing that the media gets wrong, and I've been talking about this a lot recently, and I was already talking about it on stream today, is how it defines peace. Because I feel like Americans and anyone who hasn't been to a war zone before, and this would even include, I would say, a majority of the soldiers on the planet who's never actually had to fire a gun. Thank goodness that they've had to fire guns for practice, but never at actually people. For most people, that's not an idea that would really touch their mind. Maybe it does for soldiers, but even if they have to think about it when they sign up, most of them will never have to kill anybody. Most of them will probably never actually be shot at. Maybe 5% to 10% of American soldiers will ever actually have that experience. So peace, when you talk about peace to them, the idea of American cities being bombed or car bombings happening frequently, or the type of terror that Ukrainians facing on a daily basis, it's very hard for them to relate to it because America is so safe, and the idea of it sounds silly. Red Dawn was a joke movie, and it was fun to watch, and you get to scream, Wolverines, because we all know that would never happen. They had to create an alternative universe for that to happen because America's so geographically protected and so militarily powerful. And so I think for a lot of Americans, it's hard for them to know the difference between war and peace and the nuances between it. And so how that dialogue has settled in a way around the media that I don't like is that there's two states between war and peace. There's a ceasefire, which is the peace, and then there's the active fighting between like advancing armies, which is the war. But that's not the only two statuses. For example, Ireland and the United Kingdom were not at war during the times of troubles, but would you say that the times of troubles was a peaceful period? Would you call that peace? 5 days ago, Israel and Palestine were not in open war, but would you say that was a peaceful situation when there were still bombings on the border? There were still bombings in Gaza, people getting suffocated in their homes. There were rocket attacks from Palestinian Islamic Jihad and Hamas, Hezbollah, constant threats of invasion and pushing people into the sea. Would you call that peace? And so when people talk about peace, and when it comes to the war in Ukraine, I think a lot of times they just want to be able to declare, ceasefire, I feel so much better about this. And then they get to move on to whatever the next big thing is going to be. And so I think when people talk about peace, we have to have a more nuanced conversation because, number one, the peace that we could get could be still violent in the way that the times of troubles are. There could be car bombings in occupied territory, assassinations of occupation officials, horrible amounts of repression, mass graves filled, torture chambers, extrajudicial killings, which have been recorded time and time again. And there's a decent chance that a ceasefire could be violated, like the ceasefires before were constantly violated with civilians getting bombed and civilians getting killed by mines and other horrific things that happened during the last 8 years that was not covered by the media, which is something that I also think the media got wrong, was the entirety of the last 9 years of Ukraine coverage.
and not only not covering this boiling situation, this hot spot that could have really exploded at any time when the Russians choose, but they've just completely missed how we describe peace and how we describe war, because it's not as simple as people has made it out. You have a ceasefire, and then all the love and all the the spirit of Taras Shevchenko is going to pacify the people or something. That's not how it's going to work. Also, if we have a peace deal now, does that mean that there might be not another war in 5 years? Because people could call the Minsk Accords peace if you want to, under the definition of peace, like the aesthetic definition of peace, but it didn't bring peace. They tried the Minsk Accords twice, and it didn't create peace. So I feel like we need to show the differences between actual peace, which I think involves liberation and involves not a perpetual and aggressive and brutal occupation, but also properly define war, properly define what a real peace would look like, what a good peace would look like, and talk about what would be in the middle and the reality of what that type of occupation would be like.
So can you give us like a bird's eye? This is another huge question. A bird's eye view for my audience who may not be up to date with everything. Can you give us a bird's eye view of like what's actually happened with the invasion? Why did Russia invade? Didn't Russia promise not to invade Ukraine after they gave up their nuclear weapons? What is the official kind of statement, and what do you think is actually happening?
Well, the reasons for the invasion kind of, they shift around a lot. The Russians have a strategy of just kind of throwing whatever they can at the wall, and whatever sticks, and whatever doesn't. We all remember them talking about biological weapons, and I would have thought that there'd be more critique from the Western press about hearing another leader claiming weapons of mass destruction without solid evidence before invading another country. I thought the press would learn its lesson, but it didn't get, as I think, enough coverage, that type of lie or talking about that. There is a lot of claims like that, but I'll stick to the main ones that they said at the start. And the main ones that the Russians put forward was, number one, that they needed to liberate the Russians in Ukraine. They needed to liberate the ethnic Russians. Sometimes they'll say Russian speakers, but usually they'll say ethnic Russians. They needed to defeat Nazism. They needed to demilitarize Ukraine. They needed to stop NATO expansion. And I think those were basically the main four. There's one I'm forgetting, but those were the main four. And they wanted to also take territory in the Donbass, liberate the Donbass. That was something they also pushed. And also one last thing, because they did demand this in negotiations. They also wanted Crimea recognized. So those are the official statements as to why they're fighting the war. I don't buy the official statements, though. It's hard for me to imagine that they care about the liberating of the ethnic Russians or protecting them from the shelling, which was something they often talked about, the people who died there in the Donbass over the last 8 years of fighting. It's hard for me to take that seriously when you've increased the amount of people who are dying by such a tremendous proportion, and the vast majority of those people that are dying are people in Eastern Ukraine who speak Russian. The amount of people who died, I think, in 2021, before the Russians invaded in 2022, was about, I think, between 7 and 12. Now, that's not nothing. That's still a tragedy. Those deaths are still horrible. But now we're talking about a scale of hundreds of thousands, like over 100,000 deaths. We're talking about a totally different proportion of people displaced, people tortured, people bombed and their homes destroyed. So if the goal of the invasion was to limit the violence for people who speak Russian, it has been a complete failure. And so any claim that that's what they're fighting for now, I think is complete hogwash. The denazification stuff, ever since 2014, I think was nonsense. The articles covering Nazism in Ukraine, you can see it directly spike in the search algorithm, and the amount of mentions in media in 2014 and forward. Vladimir Putin in 2008 was talking about there's no ethnic issue in Ukraine after he invaded Georgia and wanted to take pressure off of himself. So unless there was the fastest rise of fascism in human history between 2008 and 2014, and Nazism just just completely exploded in the countries, a level never seen before. And we didn't see also in its parliament, because it just did not expand like legislatively, introducing like Nazi laws. It did not get a bunch of Nazi politicians into the Rada. Like the Svoboda party, for example, I think currently holds 1 seat in the Ukrainian Rada. I never took that very seriously. The main reason I never took it seriously, though, is because the Russians also arm Nazis. Rusich, for example, which is a neo-Nazi militia that they've been arming for years and having fight in the Donbass and have been accusing, have committed a ton of atrocities, and admit to it openly. One of their fighters, one of the commanders, actually was recently arrested, I believe, in Finland, because he went over there to visit his girlfriend, and thank goodness they nabbed him. And he was somebody who was taking photos with corpses and desecrating the dead. So I never took the Nazism stuff very seriously. The stuff that I think gets the most credibility is the NATO expansion argument. But again, I could see that as a more credible argument than the denazification or the liberating the Russian speakers, because NATO has expanded, whereas in the idea that there's a genocide going on against the Russian speakers and that they need to send neo-Nazis to fight our neo-Nazis, right? Though that's silly on its face. Everybody can go and see that NATO has expanded. The thing that makes me not believe that this war was prompted by that, though, is that Ukraine was no closer to joining NATO today or at the well, actually not today. Today they're closer to joining NATO forever. But at the start of the invasion, they were no closer to joining NATO than they were in 2015. NATO put into place rules specifically for this scenario, saying that as long as you have territorial disputes that are active, like what's happening in Crimea, like the dispute between Russia and Ukraine in Crimea, when Russia illegally invaded Crimea and annexed it, and then all these people fled, all of the Ukrainians who didn't want to get purged or put in torture chambers fled Crimea, like people I've interviewed myself, that as long as that situation continues, they can't join NATO. And the French, the Germans, and other European states were open that they were not going to allow Ukraine into NATO because they didn't want to provoke the Russians. And that was the state of affairs for the last 8 years. Nothing changed. So if the problem was NATO expansion, where was NATO? Where was NATO banging down the door coming into Ukraine to join? What NATO provided Ukrainians when talking to the Russians, and this is not talked about enough, is it provided them leverage. It allowed them to look at the Russians and say, you can't give us a raw deal because we have other options. You can't completely bend us over a barrel and take our lithium, take our oil, take our resources, pile us on with debt so you own our country, and we have to possibly one day allow all of our resources to be transported for free into your country. All of these issues, it's harder for the Russians to pressure them on if they have another person they can go to and get a better deal. And that's why the Russians in 2014 economically coerced Ukraine during the Euromaidan protests in order to try to get them to join their economic arrangements, their defensive alliances, instead of joining the European Union, because they were scared of them having that economic leverage of being able to push back against them, not only with pointing to NATO and saying we can always go to them, or pointing to the EU and saying we have other economic options. They didn't like that type of pushback. They didn't like that type of counter. And that perspective of the Ukrainians being able to have more options and not just being, subservient to the Russian state, that perspective isn't often shown. It's usually shown through dirty, evil NATO expands into Ukraine at gunpoint to gobble up the nation state, to circle Russia. Very little is talked about from the Ukrainian perspective of what NATO can provide them or how NATO gave them leverage in negotiations, which I think is perfectly fair for them to be able to turn to the Russians, who have historically dominated their state, and say, we have other options and we can go to other options. And that's what NATO provided. But even if NATO provided them that option, NATO was making it very clear. Multiple NATO member states are making clear, and you need to get every single one to agree that they weren't going to join, at least not in the immediate future. I mean, I can understand somebody believing maybe France can be convinced, but Erdogan, Viktor Orban was going to be convinced to let in the Ukrainians. Viktor Orban isn't even convinced to let in the Ukrainians now after the Russian invasion. Why would he be convinced before the Russians invaded? So all the official claims, I think the one about NATO expansion at least makes some more strategic sense, but I still don't think it has much credibility. Most of the also, I think, is just, again, throwing whatever you can at the wall. It's easy as a Slav to hate Nazis, paint your enemy as Nazis, and then whatever you do to them, it's whatever, because they're Nazis.
What I don't understand about the whole Nazi argument, and I've watched you and Destiny and other people debate people who say they're Nazis, like that's the main like moral, I guess, stance they kind of stand on. But what I don't understand is that there are lots of Nazi. I mean, obviously, there's no Nazi party or like a ruling force of Nazis who are, you know, putting people in concentration camps in Ukraine. But they're talking about like the people are Nazis or white supremacists or have that ideology. But in what world? Let's grant that. I know that's not the case. Anna's talked about it. I know that they're not Nazis in Ukraine, at least definitely not to the proportion. Maybe there's
the thing is there are Nazis in Ukraine. There's also Nazis in Russia.
Yeah.
There's also Nazis in Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania.
There's Nazis in the States. There's Nazis in Australia. But what I don't understand is, how do you go from, let's say that there's a large majority of Nazis in Ukraine. There isn't, but let's say there is, right? How do you go from that, okay, large majority of Nazis, to therefore let's murder, genocide, torture civilians? How do you go from like I want to ask these people, I don't know why people don't like, people when they're debating these people, why don't they say like, therefore what? It's okay to like genocide groups of people. It's okay to even to murder children, to murder to like the shit that you uncovered in Zoom. Like, is that okay? Like, it still doesn't make it still doesn't work. Like the argument still doesn't work.
I when I talk to people about this, I like to ask a question, and usually this question produces a lot of offense. But my question is, why don't you like Nazis? And it produces offense because everybody hates Nazis, right? But I sit them down. I was list the reasons why Nazis are bad, and people will talk about like
genocide,
the killings, the murders, the genocide, and start naming different war crimes. And I'm saying, so the Russians need to go into Ukraine to kill, murder, rape, pillage, deport the locals, take their property, and then enforce your own culture in the region so you can gather resources to fight Nazi militarism, to fight the militaristic ultranationalistic Nazis, and you're going to use literal neo-Nazi militias to do it as well. It's complete bogus. The reasons why people hate Nazis should be many of the same reasons why people also hate the Russian army.
That's exactly my thoughts as well. So I don't understand how someone, it seems very much like just us versus them, like paint the enemy as a bad, like it just seems so simple, like so simply a propaganda to just go, you know, they're Nazis, so therefore we can, you know, do it. But it's infuriating because it's like, it's not true as well.
Let's say for a moment, right? For a moment that, because there is truth to the idea that ultra-nationalist football ultras, after the failure of the Ukrainian government to respond to the Russians flooding the east of the country with weapons, and there were recent interviews from, now that the Russians invaded, they've forgone any attempt to pretend that they were not involved in 2014, 2015, which they have been lying about for years. And I saw this interview, it was so fascinating to me, on Omegle, between a Russian journalist and a Russian train driver that carried in the artillery shells, the bullets, the artillery guns, and the tanks in 2014, 2015, talking about how they would go in the nighttime because the Ukrainians might target them during the daytime and they don't want to be seen. So at nighttime, they would pile in tanks and they just flood them across the border into Luhansk, into occupied Luhansk and occupied Donetsk, to arm the rebels and to arm the PMCs and the volunteers that Russia was able to gather to intervene in the east of the country. That type of stuff has been going on for 8-9 years, even though the Russians were denying it and lying about it the whole time. I forgot what the original question was, or the original point was. Could you remind me?
It's the whiskey. No, it's fine. I think I just wanted to ramble. I was just talking about how I've forgotten as well, because I've just started thinking about 2014. 2014 was was when they shot
the ultras. It was the Russians. At that time, the government failed to deal with it. There was like 16,000 soldiers in the whole army that knew what they were really knew what they were doing and were effective. The majority of the army had no clue what they were doing. They didn't know how to deal with the situation. Horribly corrupt, years of inaction and corruption and nepotism and what Ukrainians will call Soviet mentality led to a lack of innovation and a lack of preparation for this type of scenario. Not to mention, there was a huge problem with the Russian military culture and being awash with collaborators and stuff like that, and people who were paid specifically to inform the Russians, like paid informants. And so what happened was a lot of the same groups that were involved in Euromaidan, that's where Right Sector originally formed, started making militias to go out east and participate in the ATO, the anti-terrorism operation. And since the rest of the military seemed to be incompetent in dealing with the situation, many Ukrainians took it upon themselves to go out and fight. And that's where groups like Azov and Right Sector originally cut their teeth and came into formation. And those groups did have a high amount of people from football ultras community, which has a problem with right-wing extremism. Sometimes that will be just ultra-nationalist right-wing extremism. Sometimes it could even go further into neo-Nazism or white supremacy as well. And when you get into a lot of the weird like Blitzky statements about like the white race, you're going to get a lot closer to that. But that was never the vast majority of the Ukrainian armed forces. And that same culture also exists in the Russian armed forces. And even if that did exist in Ukraine, is that how the world works now? That we find out that one nation has a militia that has disgusting views, and now we all invade that country and start bombing it to all hell. To do what? To motivate more people to go join those militias? That's all that's going to do. It's just going to radicalize people to be like, yeah, I do like those groups. It's not even talking about how those groups have changed over the last 8 years, the banning of being members of political parties while fighting in these organizations, the banning of both Nazi and communist symbols by the government. But just on a basic level, even if like half of what they said about like Nazism in the Ukrainian military was true, that still wouldn't give them a right to invade the country as they were, unless we find out that that's being used to commit something like a genocide, which it wasn't. But that was the Russian claim that they made without evidence.
So, okay, let's pump the brakes for a second and let's tell the audience who you are. So you were a Twitch streamer. You were doing like Hippy Dippy podcast, which I saw a couple of. I know that you talked a lot about trans rights, I think, and LGBT rights. Is that correct?
I was on the board of Free State for a bit. It's the largest LGBTQ plus activist organization in the state of Maryland. Not activist, but it was like a board organization in the state of Maryland around LGBT issues. Trans issues I talked a little bit less about because I just don't know a lot of the medical information and I don't know all the nuance of it. And I try not to talk about issues too much if I don't know a lot about it. But I was active on LGBT issues, that's for sure. And I did host the Hippy Dippy Roundtable, which was, for a time, the largest political roundtable on Twitch.
Yeah. It was, I remember, was it you that was like, when I talk, everyone else shuts up? And you're like, that's my only rule. Is that you? I can't remember. It's been years since I
don't know if that was my rule, but it sounds like something I might have said at some point.
That's great. So Dee asked a question, and it kind of goes into what we're talking about. She asked a super chat. So thank you, Dee, for the $5 super chat. What are Dylan's plans for the future, journalism or politics? And that kind of gets into, I guess, answer that question, but I also want to know why you decided to go over to Ukraine, stop the Hippy Dippy, and I guess just go like, I want to do something important with my life. And like, do you have Ukrainian heritage, or is it like, why did you decide Ukraine?
As for my interest in politics right now, I still have an interest in national politics, but I was mainly interested in local politics in my area, where I was trying to concentrate on it because I believe you have to have a good understanding of local politics before you can truly have a real understanding of national politics. Because once you interact with those bureaucratic structures and you see how the sausage is made, and you have conversations with legislators about how the mechanisms work, I just think you derive a better understanding, and you have a realm where you can build experience before going on the national level. I think that before you go and play with the NFL, maybe you should play with one of the smaller teams, maybe in high school. It just makes sense, in my opinion. But my interest in local politics has really been shot after the local political scandal where somebody I worked for, and I felt horribly betrayed by this. The mayor of my city became mayor at the age of 14 when I was 14. That's when I met him, and I remember he was one of the first people I came out to as a member of the LGBT community because he was our city's first gay mayor. And I, was in favor of certain policies he liked, like, more scooters in the state, like electric scooters that people can pay. And I was like, oh, that's great. I like transit. I was in favor of more bike lanes and policies like that. And so I, got behind him and supported his campaign and canvassed for him while I was 16. And because, he came to my house to talk to me, and I trusted him in this way. And last year, he got outed as a pedophile who had, I think, it was like 37 counts of possession of child pornography on his computer. And it just completely smashed all of my soul when it comes to working in local politics, because this is somebody I trusted as a minor who came out to him, which also makes me feel really weird about why he allowed me, to canvass, or why he had me so deeply involved in some of his campaigning. It makes me feel betrayed that he would do this to our city, to our community, and to anyone. And I felt crushed. I felt backstabbed, and I don't really have any interest in local politics at the moment. Hopefully, in the future, I can regain that trust in participating in local politics, and I can get back into it because I do think it's important. But my work is solely focused on what I'm doing right now, and that is war journalism, because I just don't feel like trusting anybody like that again right now, because that was a really big betrayal for me.
Yeah, that makes total sense. So is the future to, I guess, keep focusing on journalism, to keep bringing attention to the Ukrainian invasion, things like that, or the Russian invasion of Ukraine? I don't like to call it a war. I mean, maybe I'm being technical here, but like I want people to understand that it's not like there's no two sides in this conversation. The Russians need to be known as like causing, doing what they're doing, not just like
the reason I ended up doing this, and it can be very jolting when you see the shift from like hosting panel debates to, being embedded with frontline soldiers on the largest war in Europe since World War II. Like that's obviously a pretty ginormous shift. But I always had an interest in foreign affairs. I used to follow the civil war in Syria when I was in high school. I would use open source intel. A lot of the maps, like a lot of the open source map stuff, they have Deep State and a few of the other places we can go look at all the troop movements. I would do that, but for the anti-ISIS operations of the SDF, and watch as they slowly closed it into Raqqa, and then went in and liberated it from ISIS. And I built an interest in foreign policy that eventually led to me working on 2 campaigns where I advised 2 small level congressional candidates on foreign policy, which I knew the odds of them winning were low, but I wanted to bear some experience from it. And all they heard that I studied international relations at UMD for like one very quick semester, and that was all it took for me to get on. And so I took the opportunity, took the advantage, and I built up as much knowledge as I could. So I don't have like a gigantic foreign policy formal training. I have taken like some classes, and I have experience working on campaigns, but I always had that passion. I just took, I would say, a generally alternative route to get where I'm at. And then when the Russian invasion of Ukraine happened, I was following it for a month from my chair, going on the map, showing all the movements of the positions, and I made a decent chunk of change. It wasn't like hundreds of thousands of dollars or anything, but I think it was significant. It was a little bit more than $10,000. And I looked at this money and I was like, this is a lot of money to make covering this war. I'd feel really bad if what I just did was like, hey guys, look at this truck blowing up. Thank you for the $100. Okay, look at this truck blowing up. Look at these people dying. Thank you for the $50. I appreciate it. That felt kind of bad to me. I felt that if people trusted my coverage, that I should reinvest in my coverage and make it better. And I believed that the struggle for self-determination amongst Ukrainians and the struggle for liberation was worth documenting enough to put myself in harm's way. So I called a few of my friends, like Michael Hillard from Redline, who has some history with journalism in this field. I got in contact with a friend of mine called Patrick Hillsman, who was doing journalism in Ukraine, had just arrived to Ukraine, had history of doing war journalism in Syria. I asked their advice. I learned from them. I tried to learn from people who had more experience with me. And originally, I was just going to go to Poland and interview refugees. But as the day approached sooner, as I was actually going to head over there, I warmed up more to the idea of entering Western Ukraine and interviewing people who were displaced internally. But the more I got into the conflict, the more I studied the conflict, the further and further I went. And before you know it, my family went from hearing, oh, I'm just going to be in Warsaw, to I'm 1 mile from the Russians here in Zaporozhye, which was, it took time for that shift to happen, but it did happen relatively fast.
Yeah.
I think what ultimately pushed me to go through with it was, number one, I got really interested, more interested than I was before, because I always thought about just doing journalism, but I was always more interested in commentary, because commentary was easier. It's easier to look at the news story, read it out loud, read out somebody else's report, and then be like, yeah, well, here's my opinion about this article I just read and don't have any expertise in. It's easy. A lot of Twitch streamers do that. But I wanted to...
That's literally Hassan's whole thing, right? And he's like the biggest political streamer. Like, someone said on... This is what made me reconnect with you and wanting to reconnect with you, is someone said on, I think on Destiny stream, that it was like ridiculous that Hassan wins streamer for politics every year, and you're over here doing like the shit and you're not getting recognized for it. I think you should be, winning the streamy or whatever. I don't know what the reward is, but like, yeah, you're actually doing the work. Like, you don't have the numbers that he has, but what you're doing is actually important.
I mean, I don't know. I think he's a better streamer than me. I think when it comes to streaming, he streams more, like 12 hours a day. He collaborates much more than I do. He has a better setup than I do. He can bring on much more interesting guests, like Congress people, like AOC, than I can. I just believe that the substance of what he has to say about the war is much less devoid of context, much less devoid of useful information, and a lot of times based on misinformation. Like when he said that right sector snipers killed 100 people in Maidan. That was just complete disinformation that he must have just picked up either on some thread in social media or through somebody whispering in his ear. Him calling the targeting of the Kerch Bridge a war crime. Like, these are all things like I can make substantive critiques of, but as a streamer, he's better than me. He streams more. When it comes to like not gaming the algorithm, but producing content that's better for this platform, he can do it better. He can play video games better than me and multitask, where it's very hard for me to concentrate on two things at the same time. I just believe the substance of his streams, especially when it comes to foreign policy, can be quite lacking at times. But that's what I think is really important, because if something's entertaining but then misinforms you, then I mean, all you really got was a laugh. Like if John Oliver's segments were all like 1 out of every 3 was like a bad take while covering a very important war, the largest war in Europe in World War II, like, you're getting a laugh out of it. But I think also there needs to be more effort done for him to do research before he makes bold statements like this is a war crime, when it is very much not a war crime. He hasn't proven it's a war crime, and no international law scholar would agree with him on. But when it comes to being a streamer, he's much better than me.
Yeah, I just think, well, maybe. Yeah, I guess so. Okay, I'll tell you. I mean, like, yeah, he's entertaining and everything like that, but I
can't
just feel
do the 12-hour stuff. I mean, I can,
yeah.
But the problem is, when I do the 12-hour stuff, once you get to the 7th or 8th hour, I'm just like, what's this on Twitter?
Yeah.
Who said that? Who said? I don't want to do that.
Yeah, no, look, maybe that's a good point.
Why am I talking?
Maybe there's a good point in what you're saying, but maybe Hassan should win the awards for best streaming. But I think what I'm saying is what the person getting across is like, you're doing like some shit that YouTubers don't do, right? Like, okay, can you explain the story? So you've gone from I've covered the war because I care about what's going on, to I'm going to go interview people, to I'm going to actually go into Ukraine, to like. There was an occasion where you had to dive under the table on stream because there were air raids happening over the head of your building. There was a
Not an air raid. It
situation-
was a rocket attack. A rocket passed a few hundred feet over not a few hundred feet, probably like it was 50 to 100 feet over our house while it was heading towards Kiev.
Yeah, crazy. And another thing that, can you tell a story about, like, you've gone on demining activities where you literally help the Ukrainians demine, but something that that I don't know if this was a demining, but can you tell a story about when there was the Russian drone following you guys?
Sure. Well, you've asked me a few questions, but the first thing I would say is I didn't help them do any demining. I want to clarify that. I filmed their demining process. I tried to record interviews, and I want to do more. I lived with them for about a year, not a year. I lived with them for about a month. That means when they went out and demined, I tried to film them demining. I drank with them. I ate with them. I slept with them, as in we slept in the same places. Okay, let me be clear.
Yeah.
I slept in the same places they did, and I wanted to get a more in-depth understanding of the type of work they do, because there's not much material on the people, their lives, who they are, and the dangers that they face in the English language when it comes to demining in Ukraine. And this is at the same time that we're giving cluster munitions to a country that has a higher dud rate than 1%, which was our limit before when it comes to transferring cluster munitions and the amount of duds that they have in them. So if we're going to be transferring these munitions, I think we should have a genuine understanding of who's going to be disarming those bombs and what tools they need and how long it's going to be an issue, because this is going to be an issue for 80 to 100 years from the estimates that they were giving me. Ukraine is, according to its environmental minister, the most mined country in the world, with 1/3 of the country. It's a very large country covered in mines. And so that's why I wanted to do the documentary with them. I wanted it to be in depth, and I'm not done. I want to go back and film more with them before I leave the country in November for a few months. But what motivated me to come out here, I guess there's a few reasons as to why I do this. And it was kind of hard to fully process it, because it was a very big change in my life. But there's a few things that motivate me. When it comes to journalism, I'm motivated by making sure that the first draft of history, which is journalism, is of quality. If something isn't recorded and documented, in 100 years, it'll be like it never happened to historians. When I think about all the different wars that happened, whether it be Vietnam, the current struggle in Myanmar, which there's so many atrocities that are going undocumented in Myanmar, these just size and scale of World War II and the amount of atrocities that went on, so much stuff there was not pictures of, there was not videos of, there was no documentation of. Now, today, we live in the age where everybody's got a camera on their phone. You can attach a camera to your chest and run around while getting shot at like a GoPro. You've got like little planes you can fly around, drones to record stuff from the skies. There's so many tools at a journalist's disposal and at the disposal of the Ukrainian people to document this. And I want to make sure that those tools are utilized in a small capacity through me being here to document what's going on. And that's what I tried to do in Kherson when we documented the Russians targeting aid workers with shelling. It injured a good friend of mine, John Jones. Russian shrapnel entered his upper thigh and his lower stomach. His pelvis ended up saving him while they were trying to rescue animals that were drowning in the water and try to look for those who were possibly still trapped, if any were, on day 3 and 4. And documenting other war crimes and other things that happened in the war, and just documenting the experiences of those who are fighting, because I would love to create something where I'm dead and gone 100 years from now. If a Ukrainian wanted to study their history or an American wanted to study their history, they could look up on my channel and listen to the people who fought the war themselves explain why they did it and how they did it with these memories fresh in their minds. Because I see so many people chasing Holocaust survivors, chasing World War II veterans 80 to 90 years after the fact. And these World War II veterans, Holocaust survivors, they would never want to, I think, in the vast majority of instances, want to spread misinformation about what occurred, because I think most of them want to contribute to history. But when you're not, it's like 80 years after the fact, you're going to lose a few things. You're going to forget things. And those things they forget are just going to be lost to the sands of time. And so I think getting them right after they've had their experiences so we can capture them as fresh as they are and as unfiltered as we can get it, that's something that I'm deeply interested in, journalistically. From an ideological point of view, I believe that Ukraine's self-determination is extremely important. I believe that if Ukraine doesn't win, it faces the risk of its democracy retracting, because people will say, look, we tried the liberalism, we tried the democracy, We tried this different way of modeling our country, and it failed. The Russians failed us. The liberal West failed us. Maybe we should go another way. And I have a fear that that other way will not be positive. And so I want democracies to succeed because I believe Ukrainians deserve representation, but also because the other options are not good options. And for democracy to succeed, I think part of building upon that success is showing the success of Ukrainian democracy through its liberating its own territory. There will be no more of a better testament to the strength of Ukrainian democracy and of democracy in Ukraine than it achieves what so many other groups couldn't. The OUN, the Organization for Ukrainian Nationalists, what so many different the Ukrainian social is not Social Democratic Republic, but the socialist republic they had after World War I for a brief period, or the German coup government that was installed right after in the Ukrainian state. What so many different activists and governments have failed to do to preserve and protect Ukrainian sovereignty. If democracy can do that, that'd be a huge notch in the belt of the democratic order and of the democratic system in Ukraine. And I think that'd be fantastic. I think it'd be good for Ukrainians, and I think it'd be good for democracy worldwide. I also believe that if the Russians do capture land and they do win concessions, that there's a decent chance that they're not going to stop here. Just like they didn't stop in after the first invasion of Chechnya, and they tried again and broke that ceasefire. Just like what they did in Georgia, and just like what they've done in Ukraine again and again and again, lying about it every single time, and people carrying their water every single time because they didn't want to face the reality that was in their face. They didn't want to face the plank in their face. They wanted to look at the toothpick half a mile away, looking for hope, looking for compromise that the Russians seemingly were not willing to take.
That's a biblical reference there. I like that. Did you throw that in specifically, or is it just in your psyche? The biblical reference.
The biblical reference? No. I like sayings like that. This is a huge problem for my translators in this country, because I'll be like, isn't it a problem that these oligarchs are kind of like the tail wagging the dog here at anti-corruption efforts? And the main translator will look at me like, what the fuck did you just say? What are you? I can't translate that. They won't understand a single word of that.
Half the shit that I say, like I did an interview on Myth Vision. It's got like 100,000 views, which is the most I've ever had on any video. It's on his channel, but with me in the video, and like half the shit I'm saying, like I said I'll say things like Australians saying, like I went to the servo, I went to the bottle-o, the service station to get fuel, which is gas in the US, or bottle-o.
Smoko, isn't it? What is it called?
Smoko, yeah, Smoko. Had Smoko. Chucked a Yui, which is like doing a U-turn in a motor vehicle. Like it's just shit like like that. No, I said push bike, which is a bicycle. But yeah, I feel your pain. I know what you mean. Just quickly, what happened with the drone?
Oh, in Zaporozhye. So that was my first time I went to the front line. It was my first time really out in the field, and we were embedded with local territorial defense. We didn't even know if we were going to get the embed while we were heading towards Zaporozhye. That was in our May of 2022, I think, or late May, or the next month, or early in the next month. And we were just going out there to see the conditions on the front line, to talk to soldiers about their experiences, and document some training. But in order to do that, we had to go to the forward operating position, which was about a mile from the Russians. And we got into a van, we armored up. I had this experience where I had a reflective press badge, and I was told to take it off. And I was like, I want to keep the press badge. It identifies me as press. This is, important for, journalists are supposed to do that. And they said, it's reflective. They'll see the press. They'll shine. It'll be a giant bullseye. Take it off. And that was probably the most in my face, like first moment where somebody really grabbed me by the neck and said, this is the danger you face. I took it off. We got in the van. We headed out to the forward operating position. We're just passing through these tunnels of trees where there'll be like a tree line here, and you're heading towards the position. But everything between those tree lines, everything else is just open fields. And randomly, those tree lines will break, and then you can just see out in the open fields. And as I was going, to this forward operating positions. As we were getting closer and closer, I could hear the Ukrainian soldiers that were kind of cheery and talking and like happy before. I could hear them slowly talking less and less and less and less. And I didn't know if I felt safer in the tree line or outside of the tree line, because when you're in the tree line, you can't see anything. You can't see anything out there. You can't see anything out there. So if there's a plane or a drone or something coming from that direction or some ambush or something, you just can't see it. But when you're out in the open fields, like everything can see you. And everybody's seen the footage of war in Ukraine, and 90% of it is random Scooby-Doo van drives down road and blows up. That's 90% of it. And what was I in? I was in a soccer mom van. Maybe not a Scooby-Doo van, but still not that protective. Any shrapnel would tear it to shreds and kill us instantly. There was no protection. And as we were going to the forward operating position, they get a call on their radio like, hey, our position's getting shelled. Don't take the journalists here. We don't want them to get hurt. So we pull off on the side of the road next to this forest. We have an open field here, forest here. And I just start trying to film the soldiers candidly. This is a period where I was nerding out so hard that I didn't even feel like I needed to ask them questions. I was just like, wow, this is history. Wow, this is history. Wow, this is history. You know, I was just really enthralled with it. And I was every once in a while to ask a few questions, but I wanted to document the casual conversations between soldiers, seeing them hug each other, be like, hey, I haven't seen you for a while. And after 30 minutes of doing this, and they've set up like an impromptu checkpoint to talk to a few, what I assumed was scouts at the time, I hear this like what sounds like a small swarm of bees. Maybe like a phone vibrating. You know, when your phone vibrates, you get like a bzzz, bzzz. And I turned to my friend Patrick Hillsman, who I talked about earlier, has experience covering the war in Syria with the rebels in Aleppo. And I said, do you hear that? And he says, no, I don't hear it. So I'm like, oh, okay, it must have been nothing. And 5 seconds later, no, it must have been no longer than 5 seconds later, one of the Ukrainian soldiers yelled drone, and everybody instantly starts running into the forest. Reason why they instantly started running was they didn't know if it was a suicide drone. They didn't know if it was going to drop a grenade. You know, this is early war, and people are really feeling the full effect of drone warfare on a large scale for the first time. And the Russians were starting to use it a lot more against the Ukrainians then. That was the first time the Russians were really starting to like kick up in the use of it. The Ukrainians were the first to really implement it a lot, definitely during the advance on Kiev, but the Russians adapt. People think the Russians are all stupid, and you know, a lot of them are, but also they learn, and Russian command has learned, and that was just an example of that. So we run into the forest, and we're just kind of squatting down in the forest for 5 minutes, waiting for something to happen, either them to make a run for it or them to direct us in some new way. And eventually they said, we're just going to make a run for the van, and we're just going to drive away. And so we ran up to the van, got in as fast as we could, started driving away, and they pulled off at a new spot just 3 minutes down the road. So they didn't get us out of the shit. They just drove us slightly away from the shit and hoped that the drone didn't follow us. Not the safest path, but at least we weren't at that same spot. Because if it wasn't a suicide drone and it wasn't going to drop grenades, it hadn't, so we assumed it wasn't. Why would it then? It would probably be a spotter drone for artillery. And we were within artillery range because we were going to the forward operating position. And wouldn't you know it, once we arrived to this new position, and my friend Patrick Hillsman, he's adamant that it was hitting the position that we were just at, we start hearing some more explosions. And Patrick Hillsman, again, he's adamant that it was hitting the position that we were at. Either way, it was probably a spotter drone. At this new position, they're trying to talk about what they're going to do. They debate it for about 10 minutes. And eventually they say, look, let's skip going to the forward operating position. This is too much. We're going to go to SPG-9 training, which is a type of recoilless rifle. So we all pile into the van, and they stick in the key. Vroom, 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 vroom. The van won't start. I mean, it's a soccer mom van painted green and sent off the war. So I don't know how long they thought this thing was going to deal with wartime conditions. These things break down, frequently, especially when you're running it into the woods, running away from drones. But it wouldn't start up. And it wouldn't start up as drones are circling in the area, searching for us so they can spot us for artillery. And we're essentially stranded outside of just making a run for it with our feet, which, I mean, the drone is faster than we can run. Thankfully, though, They eventually get it started, and we head off to SPG-9 training. And that was my first time on the front. Later, we would end up going to the forward operating position, where we had saw like the leftovers of combat. There was a grain silo with shrapnel holes all through it. It almost, when you were inside it, it's almost completely dark except for the shrapnel holes. So it almost looked like it was like a starry sky inside the grain silo. We saw damage from like tanks trying to take the position. And once again, when we were getting ready to leave, it was also interesting because they told us to take cover under a tarp. And I'm looking up at this plastic tarp, like, what's is the grenade gonna hit it in like a Looney Tunes? It's gonna like boom and like fire it back at the drone. But eventually we head out again, and what do you know? As we're gonna leave 1 mile from the Russians, van breaks down again, and we had to push it. We had to push the van until it started. That was my first time.
Are any of these situations so fucked up that you're like laughing in the moment, or is it just pure fear? Like, are you just like,
pushing the van is when I laughed. I mean, I laugh. I joke a lot, and I joke in these situations as well. I don't know if it's a coping mechanism or what it is, but I'll like crack jokes a lot of times when everybody else is very like antsy and they're like very aware of the situation. I'll like crack jokes. Sometimes I'll sing music to myself to preoccupy the mind, because when you're in those vehicles, and you're in these moments where the only thing you really can think about is whether or not you're about to get shot and blown up, or die. You want to preoccupy your mind. And when you're riding in a car, it's hard to, because when you're outside of the car, it's much easier for me personally. I think some people would feel safer. I feel safer outside because I can get down, I can lay down, I can do things that I think can keep me safe. I can get away from everyone else so we can spread out so we're not all bunched up, because a van full of soldiers just says juicy target. Might as well like draw a bullseye on the side of it. But if you're all dispersed and laying down and you're under some foliage, I feel a lot more secure, and I'm doing things that make me feel more secure. I'm preoccupied with trying to survive. But when you're in a van just driving around, there's nothing I can do. So all I'm left with is my thoughts.
Is that the scariest situation you've been in, or have there been situations that you've been more scared, even though they might have been safe?
I mean, it's probably one of the ones I was most scared. It was also my first time, so I was probably thinking about death probably most intensely compared to other instances where I've had similar things happen, like in Kherson or in Mykolaiv. In Mykolaiv, it didn't really, like, a lot of it didn't really set in until afterwards. I was mostly cussing in Mykolaiv. If you look at all the footage from there, when we were during the start of the Kherson counteroffensive, we were in the city, and the Russians just started randomly bombing it in response to the Ukrainians launching the Kherson counteroffensive, because they were unprepared and they were panicking. And it killed a lot of civilians that day, and a lot of the shells were falling pretty close. But most of that time I was just cussing. And so instead of being being chilled to my feet, I felt, I don't know, more like angry. Because I was also just angry at the situation, because it's like they're just shelling the city center during rush hour, like near all the shops and restaurants. We were getting bombed when we were leaving like a local restaurant. So I would say that it's probably one of the ones where I had more fear than the other instances where I had very dangerous situations, because it was one of my first, and it was hardest to preoccupy my mind with some sort of coping mechanism.
Does your family, they had words to you, like friends and family have been like, can you leave, or we don't like you being over there, or anything like that?
Oh, I mean, my family, while my family respects my work, obviously my grandmother would like me to do something else. She's often confused as to why I got involved in politics and this type of stuff in the first place, because she wasn't. My grandfather wasn't, and they're the ones that raised me. My mother wasn't. My father wasn't. There's not really anybody that has like political involvement in our family. They vote, of course. They're members of a union, but they're not going to all the city council meetings like, you need to put a speed bump in. They're not doing that. So they didn't really know where the political stuff came from. But they respect my work. But they obviously wish that I was doing something else with my time, and that I wasn't putting myself in this sort of danger. My grandmother already lost my mom, her daughter, to heroin, and I'm one of the things that she gave her, my grandmother and my grandfather, and I think they'd like to, preserve one of only like 2 children, and the one that they raised. My grandmother will tell me, every once in a while she'll say, I'm your grandmother, but I'm not your grandmother, I'm your mother, because I raised you. And she wants to get that across. And so I know she worries about me deeply. But yeah, they worry about me deeply.
It must be hard, but at the same, it must be very hard. But at the same time, I think, you're not out there, selling drugs and putting yourself in risk for something. You're doing something very moral, I would say. You're doing a net benefit to society, humanity. That's what you're risking yourself for. I think that's admirable, even though it would scare your family and friends and things like that. I have a question. Do you think, mainly on this channel we talk about religion? I interview Bible scholars, like I've mentioned, and professors, and we talk a lot about religion and its effects on the world. Has religion, do you think, played a part in any of what Russia is doing, and the hope of the Ukrainian people? Just to list a few things for the audience, you probably know, but the Patriarch Kirill of Moscow, the head of the Russian Orthodox Church, has been described by many commentators as supportive of the invasion. Pope Francis, the head of the Roman Catholic Church, has condemned the invasion. Magomed Kirtanev, a Muslim military commander, described the Russian invasion as a holy jihad. So do you think is this a prevalent thing? Is religion talked about at all as a reason why, maybe the whiskey's
motivating factor,
yeah, behind what the shit that the Russians are doing?
I think it's for the Russian nationalists and for the Russian church. I think this war and religion are very deeply tied. Patriarch Kirill frankly said that if you go to Ukraine and you die killing the Ukrainians, you'll go to heaven. Don't worry about it. You'll go to heaven. That's the type of stuff you'd expect to hear from very people in the mountains in Afghanistan, right? That's not something you would expect to hear from the head of a major Christian church. And I'm not trying to be Islamophobic or anything. I'm just saying that sounds like something you wouldn't expect to hear from the head of a supposedly independent religious organization that preaches, loving thy neighbor and Christian principles. It's not. It's something you would expect to hear from the Taliban or some batshit in the middle of the woods Christian militia in West Virginia. But that's what he said. And the Russian state has put forward the idea that they are fighting for Russia's unique destiny, the Russian idea. This is something that you can drag this all the way back to the 16th century, but it was really developed a lot in the mid-19th century, which is the idea that Russia is unique as a nation state due to its geography, and due to its unique role in history as pushing back the Enlightenment and pushing back against degeneracy. And its role in history is to liberate Europe from these anti-Christian and anti-Russia ideas, and to share the beauty of the Russian world with them. And the Russian Orthodox Church plays a deep role in that mission. They want the Russian Orthodox Church to dominate Ukraine. The Russian Orthodox Church operates as an extension of Russia's power. I'm being blunt about that, and it's true. We've seized documents from Russian officials coming to the United States that directly lay out how they're trying to get Russian Orthodox Christians in the United States to do intelligence work for them, for the FSB, for the Russian intelligence service. We have the head of the Russian Orthodox Church calling for basically jihad against the Ukrainians. Religious minorities in occupied territory, most of them have fled, and the ones who have stayed, like the Crimean Tatars, have found their activists bloated, dead in a river weeks after disappearing. Religion does play a role, definitely when it comes to the homophobia angle, which I don't know why, but Russia, I kind of do know why, but Russia is also really focused on the idea that they're fighting against the degeneracy of the West that is infesting Ukraine, which will then invest Russia. Homosexuality, transgenderism, Satanism, and witchcraft are the four ones I usually hear the most. So religion does play a role. I don't know how much of it is genuine and how much of it is just propaganda to scare people to beat them into the war effort. But the Russian Orthodox Church is deeply entrenched with the Russian government, and in a lot of ways acts as an extension. And that has created a divide in Ukrainian society over the Russian Orthodox Church, with not only Russia recruiting agents in the Russian Orthodox Church, but there being divide amongst many older Ukrainians that have practiced with the Russian Orthodox Church the whole life. And now we're seeing it boxed out of Ukrainian society more broadly. And they're torn between their country and their church. They're torn between God and their nation. And it's a very difficult position for them to be in.
I know one of the I love Anna. Like she's I talk to a lot of people on this show, but she's someone I genuinely care about. We've talked off air and stuff, and I love what she says. She goes, "We want I can't do accents very well, but I'm going to try." She's like, "We want your Western degeneracy. We want your Western degeneracy." Like, and I was like, that's so good. What is she like? She's queer, isn't she? And she's a vegan. Yeah. Like, all that postmodern.
She's got green hair, then red hair.
Yeah, I know, crazy, insane. Like, short hair too. Like, shortish, I guess. Yeah, just everything that I just love it. So I got a couple of questions for you that I really want to touch on, and I wanted to be careful of the time. Can you go over a little bit, or is it you got a hard out at 90 minutes?
I can go over a little bit. I usually end my streams like around an hour or so from now.
Okay, cool. All right, no problem. Well, hopefully you're drunk enough to get a great night's sleep by the end of that. There's a lot of quotes that I'm hearing around, and we're going to get to some super chats. So thank you everyone who's been sending super chats. But before we get into the super chats, there are other quotes I want to get your take on. So the first one I want to talk about, which is, I'm sorry, you might have to drink a lot more whiskey after this one because you'll be infuriated. I'll be infuriated. But Tucker Carlson, he's very critical. He almost has, in my opinion, the directly wrong opinion about absolutely everything. But he's been very critical on the US's involvement in Ukraine, and he's saying that essentially the US is falling apart, and he essentially paints the US as like degrading, and why are we sending support to Ukraine? I have my own thoughts on that, but I'd like to hear your thoughts on generally Tucker's coverage of the invasion and his point about US's involvement.
Man, Tucker Carlson, I think first I'd like to talk about how people view strength in international affairs. I feel like I was talking about the aesthetics of peace. People love aesthetics. How people talk about all the bad guys having the coolest uniforms. People talk about the Hugo Boss uniforms the Nazis wore. It really feels like a lot of American conservatives specifically bought into the aesthetics of Russian power. They bought into the church's domination in the military. They bought into all those military ads where the soldiers like, I fight for Russia. I don't fight for the pussy. I don't fight for the gays. I fight for Russia, Slava Russia. Like that, they see those and they're like, that's so cool. But then when I look at our ads, our Raytheon ad has a lesbian in it. So we're going to lose the war. Yeah. I think a lot of people, number one, didn't understand the purpose of those ads, which was in the United States, we have a recruiting problem. We're trying to diversify the people we recruit from, right? We already have a general lock on Southern pores, but we don't have as much of a lock on, I guess, LA hipsters. So I think maybe that's what they were trying to appeal to. The military has a recruiting problem, and that's why they were doing that. It wasn't because they were trying to display any sort of weakness, and I don't think they were displaying weakness. I think people read into the aesthetics, and quite frankly, the propaganda way too much. They'll see like a few soldiers like doing like a cool march, and they're like, well, this gives me the emotion of strength, so I now know the Russians are powerful. And all of that fell apart when the Russians crossed the border. That all those marches and performances and all of that, it was kind of compensating. I do think the Russians overestimated themselves. I don't think they went in there knowing that they were so unready to carry out some sort of an operation, but they were completely unready to carry out that sort of an operation. And the gay liberal bombs in the United States and gay liberal invasion of Iraq was over in 30 days. And that was an invasion halfway across the world when we don't have an interconnected highway system. I'm not endorsing the invasion of Iraq. I'm just pointing out the difference in the effectiveness of taking and occupying land between the Russian and American militaries, the woke army and the non-woke army. So that was something that I think that's one of the things that have gotten some American conservatives to start flirting with Russia. And I think that some of them have really bought into the idea of the West is degenerate and it needs a force to push back against it. And Russia shall be that force. When I hear Marjorie Taylor Greene saying on Newsmax that Ukraine is harvesting baby organs to fund its war, I can't assume. I can only assume either she's absolutely insane, which is believable, or that she's quite literally carrying water for the Russians. That's the conclusion I can come to. Now, when it comes to Tucker Carlson has been awash in misinformation in relation to this war. I think the worst example I have seen. I could talk about the thing he said to Mike Pence when he was asking him questions during his run for president, saying, in Ukraine, they oppress all the Christians. They arrest them and stuff. Just throwing stuff out he must have heard in the back of his ear or something to get Mike Pence on Christians. And Mike Pence pushed back against it, saying it wasn't true. But the main thing that really bothered me was when he was talking about casualty differences between the Russians and the Ukrainians. I don't know if you remember the Jack Teixeira leaks. That was when that National Guardsman wanted to impress a bunch of people in a Discord server that didn't really care about the fact that he was
yeah, that's right.
They started leaking them classified.
Is it like a Minecraft server?
It was called the Thug Shaker Discord server. The Thug Shaker Discord
I forgot about that. Yeah, that's so ridiculous.
Usually it's War Thunder, so I do appreciate a change in pace. But still, I wish they chose something different than Thug Shaker. One of the things he leaked was documents that showed American intel's estimation of what the casualty numbers were. And Tucker Carlson took some version of it, which was not the original version, but an edited version that somebody had photoshopped online that said, the original version said that for every one Ukrainian that dies, 2.5 Russians die for the fight, which, Russia's the invading army. We've seen them enter military catastrophe after military catastrophe. This was as they were trying to grind through Bakhmut, and Wagner was not respecting the lives of many of their conscripts very much. It's not impossible to believe. That sounds like a number that makes sense. The edited version made it for every one Russian that dies, 7 Ukrainians die. But in this altered version, not only is that number in and of itself, when you read it, that's unbelievably ridiculous. I don't know how anybody would even believe that once they heard it. But in the edited version of it, they didn't even change the other documents that refer to the original number. It was a poor misinformation hack job. And Tucker Carlson, went on the most popular name in cable news and repeated those numbers. Not once, but twice. Next week, he had RFK on to say the same thing with no pushback, reinforce what he said. Fox News at any point could have issued a retraction. They could have said this isn't true, that he's using a photoshopped version of the document, not the original document, that anybody could have gone and accessed at any time to check if it was real. But he didn't. He chose not only to say it, he chose to say it again. And at a certain point, when I see something like that, I have to think that either he's lying, he made a horrible mistake and he's unwilling to admit to it because it supports his position and he doesn't care and he doesn't want to admit to making a mistake. And he has said in the past that he will lie when he's cornered. He's admitted to that. Or he's carrying water for the Russians. And considering some of the social views that he puts forward, I don't think that's completely out of the realm of possibility. Definitely when he's describing the differences between Russian society and American society. Tucker Carlson is probably one of the worst sources you can get on this war, but it was also the #1 cable news show in the United States talking to people about this war. I saw this one poll done to that showed the difference between what Americans thought of the war before they were given key facts about the war and after. These key facts included things like Ukraine has liberated over 50% of the territory the Russians have captured since February of last year. That's a true fact. That they've lost like 50% of their armored reserves. That's a true fact. If you give them this information, the support for the war jumps like 15 to 18 points amongst Democrats, amongst independents, and the biggest jump was amongst Republicans. It was like 18 to 19 points. It turned it up. It turned our support up from like 52 to 53 to 70%. That was a massive jump. And it's hard for me to imagine when, given the facts, that's the numbers that we get, that the disinformation hasn't had an impact. And that there's a decent chunk of Americans making a decision on whether they support aid or not, and possibly legislators from the terrible performances we've seen about this war from people like Marjorie Taylor Greene saying they're harvesting the baby organs to fund the war, that a decent amount of the chunk of the people who are not supporting Ukraine is from misinformation. Now, there are people who are against supporting Ukraine because they're just isolationists. I'm fine. I disagree with it, but I understand it. Those people have always existed. But I want Americans to make decisions on whether or not we should send aid to the Ukrainians based upon what's really happening on the ground, and not some fantasy slop job Photoshop cooked up in the middle of the night in some 4chan room that somehow the biggest name of news repeated twice on his program to millions upon millions of Americans.
It's crazy, hey. Like the way 4chan has been able to like create things like flat earth and QAnon and all that bullshit. And some of it starting as a troll, and then now it's in like mainstream people like believe it. It's just crazy. It's crazy. Okay, so Jordan Peterson, what do you think about him saying that it's naive to think that the Russians will lose the war?
I agree with that. I think a lot of people in my space sometimes will look at these Twitter videos of, Russians going kaboom, and they'll get into kind of a little bit of a frenzy after seeing some atrocities and seeing how poorly the Russians performed at the start. And they'll forget that militaries adapt. The Soviets adapt after invading Finland. People talk about the Soviet-Finnish War. Not many people like to talk about how it ended, which is that the Soviets got territory. They didn't get everything they wanted, but they did end up taking Soviet territory, and there was a compromise that was came to. And I think that was in large part due to the fact that the international community failed to respond to that invasion. They failed to send Finland the support it needed. And most of the support Finland got was on a smaller scale, or was from international volunteers that didn't end up fighting anyway and mostly served a propaganda purpose. Some of them fought, but most of them didn't. And if the Western coalition supporting Ukraine is weak-willed and doesn't up the production of artillery shells and stuff that's necessary for Ukraine to win, and we see them start flagging on aid as we see certain House members trying to drag down the conversation, that's the type of stuff that could cause that outcome, then I think saying that it's a naive belief that the Russians are going to lose, I agree with that. I don't believe that the war has been won or the war will inevitably be won by the Ukrainians. I think that the Ukrainians have a lot of things in their favor and the Ukrainians can win. But assuming that the Russians will lose because the hand of history bends towards justice, I'm very sorry. Many times the people who deserve to have some self-sovereignty or deserve to have freedom got crushed, they lost, and it was hundreds of years before they got freedom. I mean, the Ukrainian history is full of examples of independent struggles having moments of like, could we do it before being crushed? This is an incredible opportunity the Ukrainians have. The Russians really butchered the start of this war, not only when it comes to the people, but also when it comes to the operations. They just did not manage it well. I doubt if the Russians invade again in 5 years, they're going to make a lot of the same mistakes they made the first time. That's another thing. The Russians in 2022 are not the same Russians at the end of 2023. They've adapted. They've integrated drone warfare much more. Their supply lines are much more secure. They have a semi-more realistic expectations about what they could possibly accomplish and how offensive operations can go. They're not just sending like armored columns in a straight line towards major cities, assuming that everybody's just going to roll over because Great Russia has arrived, packing parade uniforms and making dinner reservations in major cities that they're marching on. Those Russians of 2022 are gone. They've either were killed or they were awoken by having their friends be killed. So assuming that the Russians are going to lose when, again, they're I say it again, but I'm not saying this again. They're 5 times the size of Ukraine when it comes to literal size. Well, more than 5 times the size when it comes to literal size. But when it comes to population, they produce more shells. They produce more rockets. And as far as we know, they're going to probably be producing more drones. If the coalition supporting Ukraine is weak-willed and does not support them, then I do think that some sort of stalemate could set in permanently, and we could have a situation where this conflict is frozen, and then the can is kicked down the road. And whether another war would happen, I don't know for sure, but I would definitely say that given Russia's track record in Ukraine and Russia's stated goals at the start of this war, if they haven't achieved them the first time, why wouldn't they just try again? And not to mention, like, let's say they wait 5 years and invade again, and we have some sort of stalemate and ceasefire. Do we really think that in 5 years after all of this, that the West is going to come out again and support Ukraine in the way it did now? Maybe more so? I don't know. I'm not so confident in that. It depends on the political winds.
Do you think Ukraine can get into NATO?
I think it's possible. I think if they push the Russians out, for example, that NATO membership is going to be much easier because the barrier of territorial disputes will be gone. But there's still NATO member states that disagree with them joining, like Hungary being, I think, the main party that disagrees with them joining NATO. Now, they say that it's because they're not allowing Hungarian language schools to operate within Ukraine in areas that have higher percentage of like Hungarian-speaking communities. I think that's an issue between Ukraine and Hungary, but I don't think that's the main reason that they're holding NATO ascension back. I think that they take a lot of Russian energy exports. They're a lot closer to Russia, and this is probably a favor that Viktor Orban, to some capacity, is doing for the Russians. And he wants to get more concessions as well. But again, the former I think is the bigger barrier, because I think that Hungarian language school issue, in defense of Ukraine's sovereignty from an invading army, there can be probably some compromise found on that if the Hungarians are genuinely interested in finding compromise. But if they're just carrying water for the Russians, it's going to be a lot harder. And so I do think that they can join. If they win the war, the pressure is going to be immense on the Hungarians from basically the entirety of NATO to allow them to join. And if they don't win, in order to stop the can from just being kicked down the road and another invasion happening in the future, I think NATO membership is going to be harder. I think a situation where it could kick off again at any time is going to give pause for many Western diplomats. But if they genuinely are making a security structure at that point and not just like freezing the contact line and letting the conflict age a little bit before restarting down the line, then maybe they could find some unilateral defense pact between United States and Ukraine, or the United Kingdom and the United States and Ukraine, or something outside of NATO, which is also a possibility. And I don't think NATO is the only solution. I just think it's the clearest and most obvious solution.
What do you think about Noam Chomsky, who is he's been quite critical, and he said that he said two main things: that the Russians are more humane in Ukraine than the US was in Iraq.
Who said that?
Noam Chomsky.
Okay.
And he also said that if China was to ally with Mexico and start putting bases and things in Mexico, that US would respond worse, or at least the same as Russia is responding to Ukraine.
I mean, he should stick to linguistics. I don't know what the purposes of trying to compare the invasion of Iraq and the invasion of Ukraine. I believe the invasion of Iraq was a horrible mistake. But there are key differences between these wars. Number one, we're talking about an occupation period that went on for up into 2013, 2014. The Russians haven't even occupied the whole country. And in the territories they did occupy and have been liberated, we've uncovered tons of mass graves. So the Russians did not get nearly as far as the United States did. We were able to take over the entire country of Iraq. And for that brief period, we had control of the country. And we could decide what we do with the country. The Russians never even got that far. And the little bit of ground they did gain, controlling like 20% of the country right now, they've committed untold atrocities. So the comparison is already faulty, in my opinion. But also the goals of these two different wars, I think, are different as well. I believe that moving in with the goal of moving out the locals that speak one language and replacing them with colonial settlers, I do think that is horribly bad. Comparing it specifically to a regime change invasion in Iraq, it's hard to measure on the moral scale, but I would say that the long-lasting impacts of that could be a lot more multi-generational than when the American troops leave Iraq or when the American occupation period ends. Because that is just a straight-up land grab, old-style imperialism. I'm not going to stand here and try to say which invasion is good or which invasion is worse. But him saying that our invasion was more brutal, not only is the comparison bad, but I also think he's just wrong. I think he's just doing it to both sides of the issue because he needs to perform against the United States in every conversation about other countries. He failed when it comes to analysis of the genocide in Cambodia. And he failed when it came to the analysis of the Russian invasion of Ukraine. What was the second part of the question?
Say if China allied with Mexico,
started adding. There's a conversation between the Chinese government and the Cuban government about putting Chinese bases in Cuba right now. Those are conversations that are going on. And if the American government said that they were going to invade Cuba because of those bases, I think it would be unbelievably stupid. But guess what? There's not a single NATO base in Ukraine to this day. Doesn't exist. So I don't know.
Yeah. No,
there was no chance for them to join NATO. So even if I was I don't see that point necessarily anyway. I do think all the people calling for an invasion of Mexico are crazy. But even if I was to see that point, there were no NATO bases in Ukraine.
Do you think, are you the kind of person, I don't know how, I don't have American brain. I know that you guys, what you read the Pledge of Allegiance at the school and stuff like that. Will you call out American atrocities when you see them or when you hear about them? Or are you the kind of person who will always back America? For myself, we're a little bit, there's part of my friends and family that are very patriotic as well. And for Australia committed some war crimes Australian troops committed some war crimes in Afghanistan, and I'm the first person to say, fuck them, those people should be trialed and fucking dragged through the street. And, it's not okay to, just because, that someone's from the Middle East, it's not okay to kill civilians or torture people or whatever. What are your thoughts on that?
I was raised by a Marine, a Vietnam veteran, my grandfather. So I would say that when it comes to patriotism, I was raised in a pretty patriotic household. But I can be blunt with you that My Lai was a massacre. Our bombing campaign in Cambodia, Laos, and Vietnam was horrifically brutal, and it kills people to this day. I could talk about our supply of weapons to the brutal monarchy in Yemen that chops up journalists, which was wrong, and we shouldn't have done it, and it perpetuated an intervention that had, a few years into it, we could tell that it was not going to be successful. The Saudis were not gaining ground and capturing the ports that would be necessary to strangle the Houthi rebels. I mean, I could go down the list of all the things that America's done that I don't like, but I am perfectly willing to call out that. For example, recent event. I believe our interference in internal Pakistani politics with the ISI is bad, and it's against democratic principles. And if we're going to try to champion ourselves as a champion of democracy or quote-unquote leader of the free world, we should not be trampling upon Pakistani democracy.
Interesting. Yeah, I the whiskey's catching up with me a little bit, but I somewhat agree. I got a question from D, who's a member of the channel. Can you tell us the biggest thing you think the media has gotten wrong? And not just like the Marguerite Taylor, well, maybe tell us a Marguerite Taylor Greene conspiracy as well, but like something that you see just perpetuated that you're like, fuck, this is so inaccurate.
Russian speakers, man. From the way some of the media talked about Russian speakers, I thought I was gonna go out east, and I was gonna be seeing like little fucking Russian flags on like people's porches, and they're gonna be saying "Slava Russia, get out of here, American infidels!" But the vast majority of soldiers I've interacted with and worked with are Russian speakers. The vast majority of aid workers I've filmed with, Russian speakers. Demining crews, Russian speakers. Everything near the front line, Russian speakers, Russian speakers, Russian speakers. Territorial defense, Russian speakers. Most of the Ukrainian ultra-nationalists that I've met in the East who are fighting, Azov, right sector, Russian speakers. People don't know this. Right sector and Azov are full of people who speak Russian. Isn't that weird that we don't know that? That the people that Russia says they're here to liberate are the same people that they're also calling Nazis. Isn't that bizarre? But the media has never jumped on it. Kharkiv took the Russian army and threw them out. Odessa, they never were able to do that landing. So many different Russian-speaking communities kicked the Russian army out. They got that wrong so much. I think a big part of the reason why that people thought Ukraine was going to fall is a lot of people really bought the idea that there was a large chunk of Ukrainian society that when the Russians roll over the border and started committing all these atrocities, we're going to say, for Slava Russia, this is all good. You can murder my wife for Russia. Like, no, of course not. And the people who did have sympathies, a lot of them were shaken out of it by Russian brutality. I remember the first time I was trying to organize this trip into Ukraine, I was being told to go to Moldova, not through Poland, which is the main route the journalists use, is the crossing the border there through the checkpoints, but through Moldova. The reason why was because a lot of Eastern Ukrainians had fled there, and they were still in shock over the idea that brotherly Russia could do this. And there are videos of people who are more sympathetic to Russia at the start of the invasion as their houses are getting bombed and the locations are getting bombed, saying, why? We've treated you like brothers. They really got the Eastern Ukrainian Russian-speaking question super wrong. There is no evidence that any of the provinces that Russia has annexed, that we know for sure that the majority of those areas supported Russia's annexation, especially in Donetsk and Luhansk. Crimea is a lot more dicey and a lot more closer, but still we don't have any hard evidence of that.
Damn. I have that is, I could keep talking to you for days, but you know, we've done it all night, but hang for she. You're gonna have to pronounce this for me.
Yevgeny Prigozhin.
Yeah, what the hell was he thinking? Or was he really not thinking? He must have not known to walk under any pianos being delivered through the second floor windows. What really went down? Can you give us some context? I have no idea what Hang for She is talking about. Thank you for the super chat, though.
So Yevgeny Prigozhin is the leader of the Wagner Group. And I assume what he's referring to is when Yevgeny Prigozhin decided he was going to do a thunder run on Moscow and have the Wagner Group march on Moscow in this march of justice. Where we found out after the fact from certain outlets that he seemed to want to arrest Gerasimov and Shoigu, the head of the defense ministry and the chief of staff for the Russian armed forces, because they weren't allocating him the resources that he wanted, shells and stuff like that, but also because they were closing in on him, that they were going to take a lot of his control over the Wagner Group, which had bloated into this massive military company through the war, through the Battle of Bakhmut, through them recruiting a lot of prisoner soldiers. And Yevgeny Prigozhin would allow these prisoners to keep their prison culture in the units, telling them that explicitly. So he would recruit these prisoners who then would join the Russian army. And in the Russian army, they would act as prisoners and they would send them in waves saying you'll gain your freedom if you survive into these positions. Now, some people say that's stupid, but the people that I've talked with who actually fought Wagner, like right sector guys who fought in Bakhmut, will tell me they'll send those guys and they'll soften up the position, and then they'll send in the people with experience from Syria, the real killers that have been in Central Africa and across the world and really know what they're doing. And that softening up the position helps them, because you don't know until they start shooting who's the guy who knows what they're doing and who's the guy who's just kind of like, I don't want to be in prison for rape, rah! And they're running at the position. But eventually, the amount of shells they were getting, his complaints about it increased. His complaints about the incompetency of Russian command and how they were mismanaging the war and they were leading Russia to destruction, it increased. He was saying more and more wild statements about the Russian military and how it was mismanaging the war. He did this one video where he stood in front of a bunch of corpses and he pointed back at them and said, "This is at the hands of Shoigu. This is at the hands of Gerasimov. Shoigu, Gerasimov." And he was getting like, that is the type of stuff that if he was somebody in the Russian opposition, that would get him immediately arrested. But because his criticism was, we should be killing the Ukrainians more effectively, it was allowed to fester. But that discontent that he was voicing then got combined with the fact that Gerasimov and Shoigu were closing in on him, and they were about to take essentially his private military company from him, and they were going to write new military contracts that would have the Wagner Group soldiers signing contract with the Ministry of Defense, usurping his command, and he felt cornered. He felt surrounded. And he looked at his army of 30,000 to 40,000 soldiers, many of them rapists and murderers that they recruited from prison, and he got an idea, a devious idea, like the Grinch got an idea. And he organized a march on Moscow, where they marched into Rostov-on-Don, which is a major supply hub for the war, and a Russian city, one of the largest Russian cities in the country. They took it over and then marched on Moscow and killed soldiers along the way. They were shooting down Russian planes. They shot down Russian command aircraft. It was insane. Everybody thought that the Russian state could genuinely dissolve in the civil war, depending how the situation was developing. But then as he got outside of Moscow, he stopped. And he turned around, walked away after negotiating something, presumably with Lukashenko, according to him. And that was that. And the deal that was made seemed to be that he would have some control of Wagner, and it seemed like to me that he would have control of Wagner in Africa and be able to manage the gold mines and the stuff that makes money without having to deal with the muck and grime of the war in Ukraine. Even if he would be losing power, he'd still be in some profitable circles. And Yevgeny Prigozhin, having a long history in organized crime, this is something that he's quite happy with. I mean, maybe not the most happy with, but most people in a situation, they're already in a desperate situation. His move showed that he was in a desperate situation of him getting boxed in. But he got off relatively scot-free at the moment. But I said at the time that if Putin does not crack down on this guy, after saying that he was going to bring him to justice during the march on Moscow, and that didn't stop them, and his government looked weak and unable to stop Yevgeny Prigozhin from marching on his capital because people were putting down their guns. They didn't want to fight the Wagner guys. They're Wagner. They're known for beating people to death with sledgehammers. You're going to let a rapist, murderous criminal who's known who got put in prison for armed robbery and is known for beating people to death with sledgehammers, you're going to get in a fight with that guy? Yeah, no, I'm good as a National Guardsman in Russia. Yeah, I want to go back home to my family. That seemed to be the reaction from the people who were home supposed to defend Russia from this type of scenario. They didn't have a flank. And so, but then also Putin didn't make an example of him. And so the fear that I think he had was that Prigozhin was going to make him look weak and then encourage this type of behavior down the road. That next time there's some big security crisis in Ukraine, let's say, for example, the Ukrainians push the Russians back with the Zaporozhye counteroffensive, get to the ocean. What if something like this happened again? And so, even if he made a deal with Prigozhin, he planned and he plotted, and I believe, this is what I believe, that he then assassinated Prigozhin to make an example of him, and then gave the company to his son. And so I think what Prigozhin was thinking when he made that deal was that I have about 3,000 soldiers. That's how many he had, roughly. We don't have exact numbers, to march on Moscow. We know that there's probably entrenched troops in Moscow, at the very least, to stop this type of advance. If he kills them and takes Moscow, there's no going back.
Hmm.
And if we're being offered this deal, I mean, who else would be offered this type of deal? In most scenarios like this, a dictator just kills them to make an example of them. And so he took the risk on the deal rather than taking the risk of trying to take over the entire country with 3,000 men.
Do you think if Putin dies, the invasion dies, or do you think that's like the invasion is rooted in?
I have some. I know Patrick Hillsman, my good friend of mine. He thinks that. I think that's nonsense. Whoever takes over, if it's part of the same Siloviki elite that Putin came from, they're going to have many of the same motivations to salvage the war. They're going to have many of the same motivations to protect Crimea from the Ukrainians taking it back. Russia's annexed this territory. Under the Russian constitution, the land that they are fighting for right now is Russian land. According to them, it's wrong. The vast majority of the international community doesn't respect it. The locals don't respect it. The Ukrainian government doesn't respect it, but that's what Russian law respects. And if Putin dies and a new person takes in power, and his first thing in power is, okay, we're going to give all the land back and leave and make all those deaths pointless, there could be a fear that you're rocking the boat too much. You might be challenged from somebody like Prigozhin, who might march on Moscow, who's not going to, because he's not going to initially have the same respect that Putin did as a power broker. And I just think there's a general fear of basically showing the whole war to be a fucking scam.
I'll get another $20 super chat. This is the last one from Hang for She. Thank you again for the super chat.
Also,
Gary,
my chat, you can do super chats too. I'd like mine.
Yeah, for sure. Gary Kasparov to Sam Harris. Putin used Syria to destabilize Western democracies. Is Ukrainian now a means for the West to clap back at Putin? Did the US analyze Russian ops in the theater and see an opportunity to topple Putin?
I've heard like a few Western statements from American officials about the idea of like Putin needs to go. I know Biden once said something along those lines. But these are like kind of they seem to be mostly one-off statements, and I feel it would be hasty to build upon that to say this is Western policy. I think broadly, Western policy is get the Russians out of Ukraine. Trying to do regime change in a country with nuclear weapons is a very risky endeavor, and Russian politics domestically is so closed off and so hard to peer into as an outsider, even though the CIA definitely has decent contacts within Russia, that I think that like you're really going to be rolling the dice if you try to pull that off, unless you're in an extraordinary situation that we're certainly not in right now. I don't think the West would care if Putin got toppled. In fact, I think the West would probably be pretty happy if Putin got toppled. I'd be happy if Putin got toppled. But the West moving in troops or something like that to do that would be unbelievably risky. I do think, though, if he fails the war in Ukraine, that could be, a cinder to cause the fire, to cause that type of a crisis. I think when people talk about like Putin fighting for his political survival, I do think that's a real thing.
Yeah. Okay. Let me just shout out your channel. So for those who don't know who you are, first of all, shame on you. No, I'm kidding. I'm a bit drunk at this stage. I'm going straight to work after. This is like I start work like the minute I get off stream, which is
that's
fantastic.
terrible.
But I'm a video editor, so I mean, sometimes you need that creative juices.
That's different. I thought maybe you like worked in an office space.
No.
You worked at some storage facility or something. But okay.
No, my boss is actually a subscriber, so he watches and sometimes.
Oh, that's cheating.
But anyway, your YouTube channel, you just cover this stuff like nonstop. Like you just got some really good stuff going on here. I'm not a Twitch person, but of course I've linked your Twitch in the description as well. But so if you are a Twitch person, you can go check out your channel there. I also, for your audience, I don't know how many viewers do you have at the moment, Dylan?
I don't know. I don't have a live view count on my stream because it gives me anxiety.
Yeah. Oh, okay, yeah, fair enough. But anyway, for the people who are watching, I've described this before, but I have conversations with people usually about religion, but also about philosophy and human rights. And coming up, we have Genetically Modified Skeptic, which is he's probably the biggest atheist YouTube content creator who deconstructed his faith and deconstructed his pseudoscientific beliefs. And I've also interviewed people who worship the old gods, like Ocean Keltor here, who literally worships the Norse gods, or people who deconstruct from like Jehovah's Witnesses or Bible scholars like Dr. Robin Faith Welsh here. So it's a good fun time over here. And one other thing I wanted to mention is you've written an article for this journal called Offbeat Research. Can you tell us a little bit about this?
Yeah, so I think it was like 6 or 7 months ago, I interviewed a displaced person from Crimea, a queer anarchist from Crimea. I really enjoyed this interview because it showed a perspective that is undercovered. I see a lot of people talking about those recently. I think it should still be more about people displaced from Israel, from what is now Israeli territory, Palestinians displaced who are unable to return to their homes. But that experience is not just there in the Levant. It's also in Ukraine. And a lot of people who used to live in Crimea were forced out by the political repression from those repressed because they have ties to the Ukrainian military, Ukrainian government, Ukrainian identity, that as in they speak the Ukrainian language, or they have ties to the Ukrainian nation state, or because they wanted a prosperous civil society and not one that strangles any opposition. And so she fled once the invasion, after a year or two after the invasion, went to Germany. And then once 2022 occurred and once the Russians invaded fully, she came back and joined the military in order to liberate her home. And I think that's a perspective that is not highlighted enough in media, that if you freeze the contact line, for a lot of people, that means they're not returning home. That means that they're returning to foreign countries, or that means that they're returning to apartments that they didn't grow up in. And they would like to return to the home they grew up in. They'd like to return into their old family home that their family lived in for generations, but they've been displaced from it. I just got back from an artillery embed, and I was talking to them about this issue. And two things happened related to this that I think really touched me. The first thing was I was talking to a military psychologist, I think 10 miles from the Russians. We were embedded with the Zaporozhye counteroffensive. They were using the M777 howitzer system, an American artillery system. And I was talking to them about people displaced and what peace, like entrenching the lines as they are right now, what that would mean. And he talked about one of the soldiers in the unit who used to own a farm in occupied territory and would just look into the distance constantly, just look into the distance, daydreaming about returning to his farm when he doesn't have anything else to do as an artilleryman, because artillerymen, 90% of their job is just waiting and maintenance and waiting underground in deep holes. A shallow trench means a quick death. And that really connected with me. The idea of just your whole existence as a military man is surrounding wanting to liberate your literal physical home. And the second person was our fixer, Bogdan, a good friend of mine, who is displaced from Donetsk, the city of Donetsk. And we got close enough to the city of Donetsk that you could see some of the village outskirts of Donetsk. And he called his father on FaceTime and showed him. He was like, "Hey, Dad, look, it's home. It's home. You can see home." It was the first time he had seen it in 9 years since he was displaced 9 years ago when the Russians invaded in 2014 in both Crimea and in the Donbass. And I think a lot of times that perspective is not properly shown, and I would like it to be shown more.
Well, Dylan, everything I've said this, not to suck your dick too much, but you really do impress me with what you're doing. I recommend people go subscribe. Do you have any super chats or any comments you want to read out from your chat?
I can ask quick, chat. Do you have any questions? You want to ask me? I guess.
You can ask questions for me as well. Like how are the notes of this whiskey, which they're delicious, I will say. Actually, one question as you chat kind of formulate some questions. I have another question: is what can we do, the people who here in the West, I guess, who are looking at this war and going, "Fuck, this is horrible. What can we do?"
I mean, the main thing is make sure your representatives know that when you vote, you are voting for the defense of democracy internationally, which includes Ukraine, and that you believe that Euro-Atlantic stability and the stability in Europe is a basis for the prosperity of the United States, the prosperity of Australia, the prosperity of everybody that's in the quote-unquote democratic world. I don't like the word the West. I don't like the term very much, but I want people to tell their representatives this, because I feel like a lot of representatives don't feel that pressure. That most of the time we're engaged in making sure we engage in online discourse, but just reminding people that they do vote on this issue. This is an issue that determines whether they vote against them or for them in a primary, or votes against them and for them in the general. And I think making that well known is one of the main things you can do, because you and I do not have tanks in our garage. You and I don't have air defense systems in our garage. Okay,
It'd be awesome, but we don't.
You do not have 2,000 AK-47s locked up under your bed. Okay, I do in Kosovo, but not under my bed. That was a joke.
That's there's a meme of you smuggling weapons, right? That's like the meme.
I swear I'm not a weapon smuggler. And only the standing governments of these countries can be the ones that send those military supplies. Outside of that, there's charities, of course, you can donate to if you want that type of dopamine hit for being able to help directly after an interview like this. UA Animals is something I direct people to. When I was in Kherson, reading the report of over 20,000 animals drowning in the flooding was pretty horrific. I was working with UA Animals to set up an animal shelter in Kherson when I was down there. And I think that's a charity that doesn't get much attention, so I'd like to give it some. There's also the Solidarity Collective, and there's other organizations you can give support to as well. But UA Animals, I think nobody can be against stopping horses from drowning and flooding. I don't think anybody is against that. So that's a group you can support.
Awesome. Well, thank you so much. Do you have any questions you want to read out from your chat before we?
Yeah, somebody asked, why are you a former youth pastor?
Oh, okay. A question. I was joking about the question for me, but yeah, sure. Well, I went through a long deconstruction process. Essentially, I was a young Earth creationism person. I spoke in tongues. I laid people on hands of people. I did all the spiritual stuff. I really believed what I believed, and then I came to investigate my worldview and slowly decided to deconstruct my faith. I'm now probably an agnostic atheist. Well, I am an agnostic atheist. I no longer believe in God, but at one time I would have died for my faith. If you want to hang on, let me just find something to show you guys. So for your audience, can they see the stream?
What do you mean? I don't know. Can you see the stream?
Our faces. Like, can they see our faces?
Yeah, they can see your faces.
Cool. So I told my story here on Mythvision, why he left Christianity, 3 Bible issues he couldn't ignore. And it was, us just talking about essentially 3 Bible problems that we had. But that goes into a little bit of it. And I've told parts of my other story elsewhere. Yeah.
Okay,
guys. It's very nice to have a question from me. That's very nice.
You spoke in tongues.
Yeah. Do you want me to talk about that? We can talk. We can switch this up.
Like, when you speak in tongues, right? Can you, number one, explain the purpose of that, and number two, what did it feel like when you're speaking in tongues?
I can speak in tongues now, still, but I'm gonna poll the chat. Like, guys, do you want me to
skill you have to develop? Because I feel like I could say like I could like do gibberish. Is it just gibberish, or is there like a skill to it?
So what the church teaches, and the Pentecostal church that I was a part of, is the Bible says that the disciples of Jesus, the followers of Jesus, you'll know them by their signs, and that's speaking in tongues, laying on of hands, healing the sick, drinking deadly poison and it not harming you, holding poisonous snakes and it will not hurt you. And that's why it's actually an American thing where you get the Appalachian snake handlers who actually do. They think it's like an instruction. Man.
Those people are real.
They think it's an instruction to drink poison and handle snakes. They don't think it's like if you happen to, type thing. But the idea of tongues is once you get baptized in the Holy Spirit, you have the Holy Spirit inside you, and you need to. Sometimes you don't know what to pray, so you'll pray in tongues, and the Holy Spirit will say the words for you in a heavenly language or a language of this earth. So. And why that's important is if you remember, I don't know how well you know your Bible, but this is a story that I was told. It's in the Bible. Moses is trying to enter the promised land, and he decides to, God tells him to speak to the rock, and it will pour out water for the millions of Israelites that are leaving Egypt, which, by the way, never happened. There was no mass exodus from Egypt, but in the story, it happened. And he doesn't speak to the rock. He decides to whack the rock with a stick, and it breaks forth and all the water pours out. And then God says to him, because you disobeyed me, because I told you to speak to the rock and not whack the rock with your stick, you'll never enter the promised land. So Moses never entered the promised land, which was Israel. Joshua did. Or maybe, yeah, it was Joshua. Jeez, my whiskey's really affecting me today. So the idea was God was trying to show us the importance of our physical words. There is life and death in the power of the tongue. So there's like some law of the universe, I guess, for God, that we need to actually physically speak something out loud. So like have to physically pray for something or physically do something with our mouths in order for the prayers to work. I've heard of people having visions, and instead of asking God, tell the angels to do this, the person will just tell the angels to do this. Angels are commanding you to do this or whatever, because you have the power and the authority. So that's all along our story to say speaking in tongues was just a way to have the Holy Spirit speak the words that you may not know in the situation. So maybe you're praying for a friend, and you don't know what to pray for them, and then
but I mean, I don't know. I guess in my mind, I'm immediately just like thinking it over and thinking, if that was the case, wouldn't you hear like certain words over and over and over again across different people speaking tongues? If you're speaking a language, like if I was speaking, like if I just randomly knew how to speak Spanish from like the depths of my mind, from some connection to some spiritual plane, like I would say like uno, dos, tres, and you would hear those like words over and over. But when I hear people speak tongues, it's just like different like levels of gibberish.
No, it's interesting because I found that when I was around certain people, I would pick up new vernacular, new words, just by I guess hearing it and falling into my subconscious. So when you're speaking to like you just start, it's just kind of like comes out of you. But I will say that what I just did then is something I would do, is like speaking in tongues when I was religious. Again, I'm not religious now. I don't think tongues is anything like supernatural. I don't believe in the supernatural. But when something would happen to me that was like quite profound, like how I was in a quote unquote spiritual environment where there was just this presence in the room, or this experience that was happening to people. People were falling over or laughing or having visions and stuff. My tongues would sound different. They would sound something that I can't really emulate here. But again, I don't think there's anything supernatural involved there. But yeah, I definitely I have an interesting story, but it's a long one. So
one second, one of my fans just told me that they appreciated your interview on Myth Vision and the recent interviews with Matt Dillahunty.
Oh, awesome! That's great. It's great to hear. Well, guys, like I appreciate. It's nice to hear. There's another chat out there and people who see my stuff. I really appreciate that. I'll have to say hello to your chat. Actually, I'll just post in here now. And I'm not signed in, but. You damn Twitchers. Twitch people. I just don't understand it.
I signed a contract with the devil, man. I signed a contract with the devil.
Oh, right. So you can't stream on YouTube?
I can only stream on YouTube, but I'm not streaming on Twitch. And the content, I gotta wait like 24 hours before I can like publish the content that I stream on Twitch. It's really silly. I honestly, if I was starting my channel today, I would be streaming on YouTube. It's much better for political content. There's a much larger political community, and the space that I advertise for now, I'm trying to gather now, just better on YouTube. But I'm with Twitch. I've been on Twitch for so long, and I've already made so many big changes in content with making the shift from hippy dippy and the type of content I was doing before to the content I'm doing now. The war journalism that you know, I'm just a little anxious to make any more big changes in the immediate future.
Yeah. Well, look, Dylan, I think that you're going to go on to do amazing things. I'm going to end the stream on my end here. If you want to keep chatting, we can.
Nah, man, I'm gonna head out. I'm gonna go to sleep.
Gonna do. Yeah, you're looking perfectly drunk, perfectly tired. What time is it there for you?
It is 6 a.m.
Oh, Jesus. Okay. I'll definitely let you go. I didn't realize it was so late. Thanks again for coming on, Dylan. I really appreciate this. Anytime, man, you want to like come on or you want to do a stream together, I'm happy to come on as well. I really appreciate it. If your audience does come over and subscribe to my channel and does comment, if you put like maybe like a little Ukrainian flag, I'll know you're from Dylan's stream and I'll make sure to like read your comments or something. I don't know, but I'll know that you've come from Dylan's stream. But thanks guys. And if you come over from my chat, you join on the YouTube comments or something, I guess. What's my emoji? Put a beer glass or some sort of a drinking glass and you'll know that you've come from Deep Drinks. But thanks again, Dylan. It's been awesome chatting with you. And everyone, make sure to support Ukraine. Let's do this.